My dear Wormwood, you seem to be doing very little good at present. The use of his love to distract his mind from the enemy is, of course, obvious. But you reveal what poor use you are at making of it when you say that the whole question of distraction and the wandering mind has now become one of the chief subjects of his prayers. That means you have largely failed. When this or any other distraction crosses his mind, you ought to encourage him to thrust it away by sheer willpower and try to continue the normal prayer as if nothing had happened. Once he accepts the distraction as his present problem and lays that before the enemy and makes it the main theme of his prayers and his endeavors, then, so far from doing good, you have done harm. Anything, even a sin, which has the total effect of moving him close up to the enemy, makes against us in the long run. A promising line is the following. Now that he is in love, a new idea of earthly happiness has arisen in his mind, and hence a new urgency in his purely petitionary prayers about this war and other such matters. Now is the time for raising intellectual difficulties about prayer of that sort. False spirituality is always to be encouraged, on the seemingly pious grounds that praise and communion with God is the true prayer. Humans can often be lured into direct disobedience to the enemy who, in his usual flat, commonplace, uninteresting way, has definitely told them to pray for their daily bread and the recovery of their sick. You will, of course, conceal from him the fact that the prayer for daily bread, interpreted in a spiritual sense, is really just a crudely petitionary, as it is in any other sense. But since your patient has contracted the terrible habit of obedience, he will probably continue such crude prayers whatever you do. But you can worry him with the haunting suspicion that the practice is absurd and can have no objective result. Don't forget to use the heads I win, tails you lose argument. If the thing he prays for doesn't happen, then that is one more proof that petitionary prayers don't work. If it does happen, he will, of course, be able to see some of the physical causes which led up to it, and therefore it would have happened anyway. And thus a granted prayer becomes just as good a proof as a denied one that prayers are ineffective. You, being a spirit, will find it difficult to understand how he gets into this confusion, but you must remember that he takes time for an ultimate reality. He supposes that the enemy, like himself, sees some things as present, remembers others as past, and anticipates others as future. Or even if he believes that the enemy does not see things that way, yet in his heart of hearts, he regards this as a peculiarity of the enemy's mode of perception. He doesn't really think, though he would say he did, that things as the enemy sees them are things as they are. If you tried to explain to him that men's prayers today are one of the innumerable coordinates with which the enemy harmonizes the weather of tomorrow, he would reply then that the enemy always knew men were going to make those prayers, and if so, they did not pray freely but were predestined to do so. And he would add that the weather on a given day can be traced back through its causes to the original creation of matter itself, so that the whole thing, both on the human and the material side, is given from the word go. What he ought to say, of course, is obvious to us, that the problem of adapting the particular weather to the particular prayers is merely the appearance, at 2 points in his temporal mode of perception, of the total problem of adapting the whole spiritual universe to the whole corporeal universe, that creation in its entirety operates at every point of space and time, or rather that their kind of consciousness forces them to encounter the whole, self-consistent creative act as a series of successive events. Why that creative act leaves room for their free will is the problem of problems, the secret behind the enemy's nonsense about love. How it does so is no problem at all, for the enemy does not foresee the humans making their free contributions in a future, but sees them doing so in his unbounded now. And obviously, to watch a man doing something is not to make him do it. It may be replied that some meddlesome human writers, notably Boethius, have let the secret out. But in the intellectual climate which we have at last succeeded in producing throughout Western Europe, you needn't bother about that. Only the learned read old books, and we have now so dealt with the learned that they are all of men the least likely to acquire wisdom by doing so. We have done this by inculcating the historical point of view. The historical point of view, put briefly, means that a learned man is presented with any statement in an ancient author. The one question he never asks is whether it is true. He asks who influenced the writer and how far the statement is consistent with what he said in other books, and what phase in the writer's development or in the general history of thought it illustrates, and how it affected later writers, and how often it has been misunderstood, especially by the learned man's own colleagues, and what the general course of criticism on it has been for the last 10 years, and what is the present state of the question. To regard the ancient writer as a possible source of knowledge, to anticipate that what he said could possibly modify your thoughts or your behavior, this would be rejected as unutterably simple-minded. And since we cannot deceive the whole human race all the time, it is most important thus to cut every generation off from all others. For where learning makes a free commerce between the ages, there is always the danger that the characteristic errors of one may be corrected by the characteristic truths of another. But thanks be to our Father and the historical point of view, great scholars are now as little nourished by the past as the most ignorant mechanic who holds that history is bunk. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
Hey everyone, welcome back. We are now in our 10th lesson of the Screwtape Letters, where we are looking at chapter 27. And we only have one more lesson after this, where we go through the last chapter of the book. So if you haven't caught up yet, now's a really good time to do it. This week, however, we are going to talk about something really interesting. This is going to be a fun topic for me because, hint, it's all about time travel.
Great Scott!
There are actually 3 key points in this chapter. The first one is that when we pray, obedience to God should be our key focus. Screwtape points out to Wormwood that if the patient is praying and he's feeling distracted, and then he starts to pray about his distraction, he's still actually showing obedience to God, and so therefore he is succeeding. So that's actually something we should really keep in mind, that even if we're messing up in our prayers, or at least we feel like we are, we might not be, as long as obedience is our focus. The last point that Screwtape makes is how people have a tendency to ignore history. And if people ignore history, then they will continue to make the same mistakes over and over again. But that's not the point I want to focus on this week. This week I want to focus on an idea that is conveyed throughout the book, which is the timelessness of God. Screwtape starts out by saying that the patient seems to think that time is an ultimate reality. Now, what is ultimate reality, you may ask? Glad you asked that question. Ultimate reality is a philosophical concept where we are trying to figure out what is the really real, what is ultimately real. Now, I realize that at first glance this might seem kind of silly, because we all know what real is. We do it all the time. That cartoon isn't real, but my bedroom is. That paper that I'm going to write and present to class is real, but that dream that I had about me doing it in my underwear isn't real. I hope. But that's not really what we're talking about here when we talk about ultimate reality. When we say ultimate reality, we're not just pointing at things and saying real, not real, real, not real, real, not real. That's not what we're doing.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
When we ask the question of ultimate reality, what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out what is the common factor among all the things that are actually real. For some people, the answer to this question is simply physical matter. What we see is what we get. As long as we can test it in a lab, that means it's real. For some people, they think that none of this is real and that there is some kind of simulation going on and everything we see is fake and we need to get outside of that simulation and find out what the really real is.
You've been living in a dream world, Neo.
But for a Christian, what is ultimate reality? What do we really think is really real? As I said before, Screwtape points out that we tend to think of time as being part of ultimate reality. Here's what he says. But you must remember that he takes time for an ultimate reality. He supposes that the enemy, like himself, sees some things as present, remembers others as past, and anticipates others as future. However, as Screwtape points out, this is not how it is for God. God doesn't see the future, he doesn't live in the present, and he doesn't remember the past. For God, all of those things are in the now.
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
Pretty trippy, right?
Very complicated.
Now, if you're having difficulty understanding this, don't worry, you're in good company. Because trying to understand how God is outside of time while we are inside of time is a very difficult task. Every analogy that we come up with is going to fall short in some way, and in some ways might even be more confusing. Here's how the Bible describes it. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish my purpose. 1,000 years in your sight are like the day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. But do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. Whenever I read those passages, I can almost feel the writer struggling with, how do I describe this to people? It is so complicated.
Very complicated.
This is one of those situations where we're just going to have to accept that we are never really going to fully understand this part of God. And that's kind of the point, because he's God and we aren't. For some, this might seem a little frustrating, but remember, we accept things that we don't fully understand all the time. Why does gravity work? Do you know? Do you understand it? Probably not. But you just accept that it does and are glad that it does, otherwise you'd be floating around. On second thought, that might actually be kind of cool. I'm getting a little off track here.
Wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey.
So let's bring this all back in here for just a second. What should we do with the idea that God is timeless? Well, for Christians, it actually does two things for us. The first one is that God is ultimate reality. Behind all that there is God. Behind all existence, all of creation is God. He created it, he sustains it, and one day he will correct it. The second thing is that because God exists out of time, that actually means that prayer makes sense. Now, what do I mean by that? Have you ever thought to yourself, why do I pray if God knows the future? Because if God knows the future, then isn't he going to know what I'm going to say before I even say it? And if he knows what I'm going to say before I say it, then why should I even say it? And if he knows what I'm going to say before I say it, does what I say have any impact on what he does? Because hasn't he already decided what he's going to do before?
It got away from me, yeah.
Despite the fact that I went a little overboard there, this is a great question, but it's based on the false premise that God knows the future in the same way that you know you will go to bed tonight, you will brush your teeth, you will get ready for bed, you'll go to sleep, and you'll wake up the next morning. You know these things because you assume they will happen. But God isn't a time traveler that jumps into a machine, goes to the future, gets some information, and then comes back again with that information to make changes to the present.
We're sending you back to the future!
That's not how it works. Screwtape actually puts it this way. For the enemy does not foresee the humans making their free contributions in a future, but sees them doing so in his unbounded now. So if you ever have a moment where you're questioning whether or not your prayers are effective, the answer should be yes. Because God sees you deciding to pray, praying, and the results of that prayer all at the same time. Whoa. This shouldn't make us afraid or confused. In fact, this should actually give us a lot of confidence in our prayers, because we have a God who can answer our prayers either in the positive or the negative in such a way that encompasses all of time and space. He has knowledge of both the past, present, and future in his unbounded now. Thanks so much for joining me this week. Remember, next week is our last lesson in this series. I'll be letting you guys know soon what our next series is going to be, but I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Take care.